Okay. Conversation, take one. Get it out.
Yeah, that's good.
So, we've been talking about this forever, and I know that you've spent the vast part of your recovery in your life coming up with this concept, with this disease and treatment concept. So, what made you get started? How did you go down this road?
The thing that motivated me is that as I started on my own personal recovery, and a lot of the people that I had come into recovery with, slowly but surely, were using again.
Yep.
And as I watched the overwhelming majority of these people return to active addiction, I started to ask myself, what's really the issue? Why is this happening? And that's motivated me. Plus, and then in my own behaviors, being abstinent from substances, but my behaviors with gambling and then sex, I started to really, really question the nature of what was motivating me, what was driving me, what was the driving force underneath all the things that I was doing. Even though I knew better, I wasn't doing better.
Well, because you've been aware that the disease is affecting you even though you're not using through the years, right? A lot of people don't have that awareness. They think as long as they're not using, they are okay. They're recovered.
Well, the established idea now is it's not even called substance abuse disorder anymore. It's substance use disorder. That the disease is directly correlated to the substance. That's not my experience. I say I'm not a victim of drugs. Drugs did not do this to me. In the largest 12-step drug recovery fellowship in the world, it says what makes us addicts is the disease of addiction. It's not the drug. The addictive use of drugs is a symptom of the disease, right? And that's my experience. I did it to myself through the use of drugs. It's a completely different concept.
Yeah, but it's, in the 12-step recovery world, it's all, based on if I'm not drinking today, then I must be doing the right thing, and all I have to do is go to meetings and not drink. I just don't drink and I don't die, and everything's going to be fine. But that hasn't worked for the vast majority of people coming in.
Well, fortunately, and I've benefited from it as much as anybody, and I'm eternally grateful for it. But when you look at the long-term, in 35 years of being at this, when you look at the long-term success rates, they're less than 10%. It's impossible to quantify. In 1984, when I started, the unofficial number was 3%. I'll give you 10% for the sake of argument. It might be up to 5 or 7, but still, in my observational experience, being a frontline, hardcore, dedicated guy to this all my life, 9 out of 10 people inevitably return to some type of,
Right, but what you and I have talked about is that we've had periods, I know when I first got sober, immediately I turned to food and sex as my escape. Yes, I wasn't using. I was trying to work a spiritual program.
You're not smoking crack,
right?
Food and sex is is minimal compared to.
Well, it's minimal until you become obese, and then you're starting to feel so bad about yourself that eventually it's going to take you back to.
But that's the mechanism of the disease.
Yeah.
That's how the sickness works, and that's the point that I'm trying to make in this whole thing, is that you bottom out into substance because of the consequences, emotionally, spiritually, circumstantially, are so dramatic that it brings you to that moment of surrender. Mm-hmm. So now you're abstaining and you're starting this process of recovery, but then you find yourself relating to these other symptoms addictively.
Right.
People aren't addicted to food, but they relate to food addictively. I wasn't addicted to sex. I wasn't chasing the euphoric recall and gratification of sex, but I was relating to sex addictively. the same mechanism. It's the same exact mechanism, whether it's drugs, whether it's sex, whether it's food, whether it's shopping, gambling. The mechanism is exactly the same. The catalyst for that is different, but the mechanism is exactly the same.
Yeah. So what's the process for somebody who's trying to stay sober for long periods of time and they want to employ, what you're talking about is, number one, admitting that the disease still affects me on a daily basis. I still have the disease of addiction even though I'm not using.
Well, let's get as rudimentary as we can. And in your nomenclature, I always say you got to get off the alcohol to treat the ism. And if you don't treat the ism, you go back to the alcohol. So understanding that the ism is the thing that initiates the process of relating to alcohol addictively. People relate to alcohol addictively in a psychological way long before they develop any type of physical dependency on alcohol, right? But we want to start at the physical dependency of alcohol and how that obsessive compulsive process works without looking at how long a person has been relating to alcohol addictively before they go from the psychological to the physiological.
Yeah, well, some people think that they were born alcoholics.
So you have to define what that means. What that means is you're born with the ism. And then you relate to alcohol addictively to compensate for the ism.
Yeah, because they'll say, "Oh, I was an alcoholic from the first drink I took."
And based on what you saw me do with the magic line, that explains it perfectly. Because the first drink that you took gave you a sense of normalcy and compensated for that neurochemical deficiency.
Right.
A normal quote-unquote person, when they take a drink, they experience the euphoria of the alcohol, but it doesn't transform their brain chemistry into a sense of normalcy and wholeness and well-being. So the ism is the thing. I always say the disease is the feeling you have when you're not on this substance.
Yep.
When you're not on the drug, that's the disease.
Yep.
The substance or the behavior, sex, shopping, eating, whatever that is, it's like sugar. I don't relate to sugar addictively, but a lot of people do. It's not that they're addicted to sugar. They're not eating sugar for gratification. They're eating sugar because it's the same mechanism of it elevates the dopamine and the neurochemical release, and it gives you that feeling of well-being, and then when it goes away,
Then you crash. Yeah.
and it's a self-escape thing. You eat more to try to compensate that. But then,
Yeah.
so what happens
But
is,
even the crash can be an escape in itself.
100%, 100%.
Yeah.
So if you look at it methodically, and you've seen this show on TV, My 600-Pound Life. There's people on this show, unfortunate. Those people are relating to food in an extreme addictive way to the point where it's observable.
Right.
That it's made their lives. That guy is eating 50 chicken wings at the same time for the same reason that a person is drinking alcohol addictively. That's the symptom that gives them that false temporary sense of well-being and self-escape. But as soon as that happens, they're already feeling negative and hating themselves for putting themselves in that position. It's the same exact mechanism.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So, with numerous years clean, 5 years serious gambling problems, lost everything that I owned, got kicked out of my place because I got my car repossessed, and it was a downward spiral. Repossessed my car, couldn't get to work, lost my job, couldn't make any money to pay my rent, got kicked out of my place to live. The whole thing was a nightmare. I was relating to it addictively for the same reason that, for a guy that used every drug from hairspray to heroin, I was relating to it in exactly the same way.
Right.
And then at 13 years of abstinence from the drug, I was relating to sex in an extremely detrimental way that was causing other people in my life tremendous amounts of harm as I was harming myself. I wasn't doing it to them, I was doing it to myself. They were just in the way. It's like drug addiction, it's the same exact thing. Drug addiction is a symptom of the disease of addiction, right? You can't become physically addicted to PCP, but lots of people smoke PCP addictively.
Right.
Inhalants. You can't go into a hardware store and buy a can of paint without showing your ID and being over 18 years old.
Right.
Because they're relating to the inhalants in an addictive way. They're not addicted to the inhalant, but they're relating to an addictive way.
Yeah.
And yours is a perfect example. You're a guy that came in, you worked diligently at it for about 8 years,
Yep.
and then you started to avoid the responsibility, and the consequence is that relapse isn't using. Relapse is the regression to when you pick up. Relapse ends in active addiction. It ends in drinking. Then you started the addictive cycle of that, which is a separate thing. But we use those terms the same way. He relapsed. No, he used.
Yeah.
He was in relapse before he used.
Yeah.
But it's a regressive process that leads to that. So all these questions need to be answered and addressed in a logical way. There's got to be an equation that takes all those things into consideration. And this whole, you're triggered into euphoric recall and that relapsing is an event.
Right.
If you have a bad day or you see somebody that you used to shoot heroin with, that you have the potential of picking up. Never, ever in 35 years have I ever seen it work that way. I had a daughter that died when I had 7 years of abstinence when she was 19 months old. I had a girlfriend murdered by her husband because she was seeing me 30 days before that.
Yeah.
I lost in 08, 09 when the housing market crashed. It ended up affecting my business. I ended up losing my house. I ended up losing my business. Wife and I ended up getting divorced. There was all these circumstantial things that were going on that didn't cause me to pick up, because not treating the internal spiritual malady, not treating the disease is what leads people to picking up. It's not the circumstances triggering some desire to escape from an external reality. It's our internal reality that we're escaping. So my whole disease model, the conclusion that I came to, having 13 years and, relating to sex in an extremely addictive way, even though I hadn't used substances in a long time, was that there was an underlying superseding irrational motivation that was driving my behavior. And that's what I needed to identify, and that's what I needed to define. So once I understood that the disease was an internal self-perception, the disease of addiction is based in internal self-perception. When I look in the mirror, I see something that nobody else sees, and I hear a voice that nobody else hears. That's the nature of the sickness, and I tell people all the time, I can prove it to you. Take your cell phone in the bathroom, set the timer for 60 seconds, and stare at yourself as long as you can. You'll know exactly why it is that you're doing to yourself what you're doing, and most people can't make it to 60 seconds. Because you hear that voice saying, I know who you really are. You got everybody else fooled, but I know you. So when other people look at us, Jay, you're a smart guy, you're a talented guy, you have all this creative, artistic thing, but when you look at yourself in the mirror, you hear, I'm not enough.
Yeah, or I hear, if they really knew who I was, they wouldn't hire me, or if they ever find out what I did, or if they ever find out where I came from, they might not be so friendly, or they may not give me their business or whatever.
But it begins with what you said, if they knew who I really was. All those things that you did were a consequence of feeling how you felt about who I really am.
Right.
And it really, as I looked at it, all the things that I was motivated, I was seeking love, feeling loved, feeling whole, feeling like I was enough, and escaping from not having that feeling at the same exact time. That's insidious. That's what makes the disease insidious, because we're seeking normalcy. People with this disease are seeking a sense of well-being. They're seeking a sense of wholeness. It's not a disease of more. It's a disease of never enough. You're seeking more to compensate for that feeling of never being enough.
Right.
So you're trying to create a sense of feeling whole, normal, and a well-being within your own skin through these external things. What we always say, I'll do anything to get out of my own skin. So what does that tell you? That tells you that's the problem. Being in your own skin is where the disease begins.
Yeah.
And the substance, it works.
Yeah. I mean, the first time that I smoked pot and got it the right way, it was a spiritual experience.
Exactly right.
It was, I felt at ease, it was fun, it was exciting.
But on a neurochemical level, what's happening is that the first time you got it right and excessive released all those chemicals, it compensated for that deficiency and it gave you that spiritual experience of...
Oh yeah, I just felt like, okay, I'm okay.
That's right.
I'm okay, I fit in.
But
like, I'm not conscious, there's 7 other guys around and I don't give a shit what they think.
Exactly right. It makes us okay with ourselves.
Right.
And that's the nature of it, and then that's what we continue to pursue. And then after a certain point, you don't even get that feeling anymore. Now you're just escaping not having that feeling. Mm-hmm. You're not getting anywhere close to the magic line anymore.
Right.
But it doesn't matter, because you have no other form of being able to create it or escape from not having it.
Right.
That's the mechanism of the sickness itself.
Yeah.
It's a subconscious negative self-perception. Dr. Howard Westman says it's a chemical disease that it expresses itself spiritually and emotionally. Well, what does that mean?
Well, so let's say now I've been sober for a while. I've been sober for 2 years or 5 years or 9 years in my case. So what are the feelings? How do I describe what the disease feels like, even though I haven't been drinking in a long time? What does it feel like on a daily basis?
So let's define spirituality in the simplest form that we can without getting into the other thing. I think spirituality is a sense of connectedness and a sense of wholeness. Mm-hmm. So the disease is, even though I haven't used in those periods of time, I still feel disconnected and I still feel lacking a sense of well-being. Because you have to say to yourself, why do spiritual principles treat the disease? Spiritual principles don't treat Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. There's legitimate neurochemical brain diseases that practicing spiritual principles doesn't compensate for. So if addiction is a brain disease based in your brain chemistry, which everybody pretty much agrees to that, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But how does practicing spiritual principles treat that? Because if it's a subconscious negative sense of self, recovery is a conscious positive sense of self. Right. So that's what you have to continue to create. And that's why people like you at 8 years that stop consciously doing that, that regressive, the scientific term of it is called synaptic pruning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you don't consciously stimulate those synaptic neurochemical relationships to build and strengthen those neural networks, the brain automatically starts pruning those things back and using that energy in other ways. It's like learning a language or learning to play a musical instrument. When you're learning it, you have to consciously do it, but then it goes into your subconscious and it's there. But if you stop practicing, if you haven't played the piano in 10 years, you can't play it as well as you could 10 years ago.
Right. Well, that's what in AA we call that a dry drunk. This is a dude who's not been drinking for a while, but he's not treating the sickness. So he's angry, he's disconnected, he's agitated,
But dry drunk is the process of relapse.
Oh,
that's what it is. Because your brain is, because that's why recovery has to be a conscious process, a conscious contact with our higher power.
Right, but some of these people hold on for years and years not drinking, but they're miserable, and they don't have struggle with relationships. They don't have, they don't fit in, and they just pretty much stay at home and watch TV.
I've seen it happen. Inevitably, sooner or later, it shows up in 90% of the people.
Right.
I mean, I've known countless numbers of people, literally, that had 20 to 30, even over 30 years that returned to substance abuse. And it wasn't because they were triggered into euphoric recall because they came out and had a flat tire. It's because they were on a dry drunk or they were in the process of relapse.
Yeah.
And inevitably, if they don't resort to the ultimate evil, the substance, mm-hmm. they're doing what you're saying. That doesn't mean that they're not relating to pornography addictively and self-escaping through that.
Yep.
right? So there's other detrimental symptoms that they can use.
Well,
to
you
do
see
that.
people start buying a lot of stuff, they start fronting, they want you to think that they're doing okay, they got all kinds of nice stuff.
Can't tell you how many guys I know from the city.
Yeah.
They have 50 pairs of white tennis shoes. One is white with green trim, one's white with yellow, one is white with black. But they got 50 pairs of tennis shoes in their closet so they can match it up. So they're shopping and buying that addictively to compensate for.
Yeah, for a feeling that they can't even describe. They can't even I haven't used drugs in 3 years, but I'm still having problems fitting into the world, and so.
But it's not even that. It's a problem of being okay in your own skin.
Yeah.
People say I use drugs to fit in. It's not true. I use drugs because I felt like I didn't fit in.
Yeah.
So the drug gave me, I'm okay.
Right.
Doesn't care. I don't care if I don't fit in. So I sought to fit in because I felt like I didn't fit in. That's a different level of honesty. That's the next level of honesty, and I think that that's the thing ultimately that causes so many people to return to, because they never intrinsically deal with that sense of disconnectedness and that lack of well-being within themselves. And that's why the concept of a higher power is so prevalent. I know a guy who's an atheist, hardcore dedicated atheist, and he would always say, I don't believe in God. But then the next sentence out of his mouth was, but I live the spiritual principles to the best of my ability, and that's my recovery. So the concept of a God and the application of spirituality, because there's a lot of people that have an intellectual, conceptual idea of a higher power, but they're self-destructing. It's only through living conscious stimulation of those chemicals that treats the sickness. And you have to ask yourself why. There has to be a legitimate explanation to that. And the reason is because it is a disease of self-perception. And when you tell the truth, you're altering how you see and feel about yourself.
Right.
When you tell the truth and take responsibility on a deep subconscious level,
You feel good.
being me is enough.
Right.
But when you lie, what are you doing? You're saying being me is not enough.
Right.
That's why we admitted we were powerless. The whole thing is based on self-honesty. Why? Because the more honest you are with yourself, the more you validate and affirm your sense of your own well-being. And your brain responds to that. Your brain responds to the conscious application of spiritual principle, and it changes your internal self-perception. But because you could self-esteem your way out of not having a disease anymore. If it wasn't a subconscious thing based in your development, the disease is genetic and environmental, your environmental influences. So people have a genetic predisposition to what? To relate to alcohol addictively? No, they have a genetic predisposition to this underdeveloped sense of self. And their specific chemical combination is satiated and satisfied through using alcohol. But that wasn't my case. Like you, cocaine was your thing. Me, I like narcotics, right? Because that specific brain chemistry gets satisfied by that particular thing. Right? I hated smoking PCP, but in the 70s, I knew a ton of people that smoked PCP every day.
Yeah.
Because for whatever reason, that particular, right?
Yeah.
Chemical release combination was what enabled them to feel and escape from
Right.
a sense of well-being.
Yeah.
So there's got to be an equation that takes all those things into consideration, everything that you're saying. And the models that are out there now, they don't, the idea that a person stays sober for 20 years and then they just have a bad day, or Pabst Blue Ribbon is on sale and they decide to pull in the liquor store and have a drink, it's just not true. So that doesn't make any sense, that you're triggered into euphoric recall by your stressors. Better coping mechanisms to manage your stressors to deal with life.
Yeah.
35 years of frontline dedicated work on myself, that's not the conclusion that I came to. The conclusion that I came to was if I'm not treating that internal spiritual malady, if I'm not recovering from that subconscious negative sense of self.
Yeah, but you've worked with hundreds of people, bringing them through the process of recovery, and you found the same.
And what I've seen multitudes of times with all those people that I've worked with is that there's a guy that called me the other day. I worked with him for 5 years. And for 5 years, he was legitimately in the process of doing the work. What was he doing? He was creating a conscious positive sense of himself to balance out that subconscious negative sense of himself. The scientific term is called neuroplasticity. That's what happens.
Yep.
When you consciously put energy towards those synaptic connections, they strengthen and they build and then they create more. Right? After 5 years, he started to avoid what he needed to do. 18 months later, he was using heroin again.
18 months. Yeah.
Because it's like exercise, right? You start out exercising, you're weak, you're not strong, you do the minimum, and you build up. But what happens over a period of time? You get stronger, you get healthier, you feel better. Recovery is the same concept. But if you stop working out, you don't in one day lose all the attributes of your, right?
Yeah.
The physical attributes and the respiratory benefits.
Yeah.
But over a period of time, what happens? It atrophies to the point where you're back to, and then your metabolism slows down, you're gaining weight, you're feeling bad about yourself, so it feeds on itself and it ends up in that place. So recovery is the same kind of thing, but obviously when you've only been doing it for 30 days, it only takes, we do that thing all the time about get the air out of this cup, right? How do you get the air out of that cup?
You got to pour something in. Yeah, you got to pour stuff in.
It's a displacement process. The more consciously you work on the positive, it displaces the negative.
Right. So that's why in the beginning, going to lots of meetings is a good thing, because there at least you're getting some positive input, and you're talking to a sponsor, and you're starting to this process of filling up the cup.
Well, let's go back to what we talked about, spirituality. It's a sense of connectedness. Right when you go and you're around all these other people that are aspiring and working at improving themselves, you feel a sense of connectedness to them, and that's a very, very powerful thing that helps a tremendous amount of people. But if you don't transition from taking the connectedness to an internal sense of well-being, right?
Yeah.
That connectedness has to continue to grow. And so that the initial connectedness you feel to other people ultimately has to become some type of spiritual connectedness within yourself to the whole universe.
Yeah.
Right? Where you feel like you're a part of.
Yeah.
Right? Even if after a long period of time, I still participate, but I'm not going to 15 meetings a week, I'm going to 2, but I'm doing all this other stuff. So that connectedness is still important, but the sense of wholeness and well-being.
Well, you're doing stuff to take responsibility for your spiritual condition, for your sense of wholeness.
So what is your spiritual condition?
Well, no, why do people stop taking responsibility for that? Because people have 2 years to go back out, they have 10 years to go back out, so why don't
where
they...
the process of relapse starts? There's only one reason people use once they stop. It's avoidance. Nobody wants to admit that it's me. That it's how I see and feel about myself. It's the alcohol, it's the drugs, it's the gambling, it's the food, it's all these external things. Because once you work on it for a while, then you have to start getting closer and closer to the fact that it's really me.
Yeah.
And how I feel about myself alone in my own skin, you start to avoid that, and then what do? You justify, well, I haven't used a substance in 7 years, so that means I'm okay. But that dry drunk, that relapse process starts to happen. Yeah. Because it's avoidance. So like I was saying, at 30 days or 60 days or 90 days or 1 year, right? It doesn't take nearly as long for that relapse regressive process to take over. It evaporates right away. So back to that analogy right there, what happens if you stop putting stuff in that cup? What stops it? What happens if you stop filling it up?
Well, it evaporates. It dries out.
It evaporates without your permission, without your consent. Because that's what people do. That's enough. That's as far as I want to go. This is good for me right here.
Right.
But the negative sense of self, by default, is evaporating the quality